The scarred cowboy's marriage proposal came with a blood-chilling warning. The man who murdered the last schoolteacher was hunting Abigail next. "I'll protect you with my life," Ezra Blackwood vowed, his calloused hand offering both salvation and an unexpected chance at love on the merciless frontier. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September wind carried the scent of dying grass across Redfern Ridge, whipping through the wooden slats of the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Abigail Wynne had spent the better part of 8 years teaching arithmetic and reading to the children of ranchers and shopkeepers. The building groaned against the prairie gusts, its weathered boards bearing witness to countless seasons of harsh Wyoming weather. Abigail stood at the chalkboard, her brown hair pulled back in its usual tight bun, watching young Tommy Fletcher struggle with his multiplication tables. At 33, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her days: rise before dawn, walk the quarter-mile from her small cottage to the schoolhouse, teach 10 to 20-odd children ranging from 6 to 14, then return home to the silence that had become her constant companion. 7 times 8, Tommy," she said gently, her voice carrying the patience that had made her beloved among the families of Redfern Ridge. The boy's face scrunched in concentration, his tongue poking out slightly as he worked through the problem. 56, Miss Wynne." "Very good," she smiled, the expression lighting up features that, while not conventionally beautiful, held a warmth that made people feel seen and valued. Her mother had always said Abigail's eyes were her finest feature, a soft hazel that seemed to change color with her moods, though they had grown more wistful with each passing year. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden desks where her students bent over their slates. She had arranged the desks herself when she first arrived, spacing them just so to catch the best light. Everything in the schoolhouse bore her careful attention: the alphabet cards she had painted by hand, the small library of books she had purchased with her own meager savings, the pot-bellied stove she tended with the devotion of a mother caring for a child. This place had become more than her workplace. It was her refuge, her purpose, her identity. Here she was valued. Here she mattered. Here she was not just the spinster teacher, but Miss Wynne, who had taught the Carmichael boy to read despite his struggles, who had shown Mary Patterson that girls could be just as clever with numbers as boys, who had somehow managed to maintain order and learning in a frontier town where formal education was often seen as a luxury. As the children worked on their lessons, Abigail's gaze drifted to the window and the vast expanse of prairie beyond. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, interrupted occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees that marked the path of hidden creeks. It was beautiful in its starkness, this land that demanded so much of those who chose to call it home. She had not chosen it, not really. 8 years ago, she had come to Redfern Ridge as a young woman of 25, carrying little more than a teaching certificate and the desperate hope that distance might heal the wounds left by a broken engagement back in Ohio. The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside drew her attention back to the present. Parents sometimes came early to collect their children, especially when work on the ranches was pressing. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 3:30. Soon she would dismiss the class and begin her solitary walk home. "Miss Wynne?" Sarah Mitchell, one of her brightest students, raised her hand. "I finished my arithmetic. May I help Tommy with his?" "Of course, dear. That's very thoughtful of you." The boots on the steps grew closer, and Abigail heard the distinctive jingle of spurs. Definitely a rancher. She smoothed her gray wool skirt and prepared to greet whichever parent had come calling, perhaps to discuss their child's progress or to ask about additional tutoring. The door opened with its familiar creak, and a shadow fell across the threshold. But this was no ordinary shadow. It seemed to fill the entire doorway, broad-shouldered and imposing. Abigail looked up from her desk and felt her breath catch in her throat. Ezra Blackwood stood in her schoolhouse, his black Stetson held respectfully in hands that seemed large enough to span the width of her desk. She had seen him before, of course. Red Fern Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by conversation, but she had never been this close to the man who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that had clearly been shaped by years of hard physical labor. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face bore a long, jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a harsh line against his weathered skin. But it was his eyes that struck her most, a deep brown that seemed to hold depths she could not fathom, gentle despite the intimidating frame that housed them. "Miss Wynne," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from the few times she had heard him speak at church or town meetings, slow and rumbling like distant thunder on a summer evening. "Might I have a word with you?" The children had gone quiet, sensing the presence of one of the most powerful men in their small world. Tommy Fletcher's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Ezra Blackwood was the stuff of local legend, the man who could break horses with a whisper, and who had once fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a knife to save a young shepherd boy. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Abigail managed, though her voice came out slightly higher than usual. "Children, please continue with your work quietly. I'll be just outside." She rose from her desk, suddenly conscious of how small she must appear next to this giant of a man. At 5 feet 4 inches, she was of average height for a woman, but Ezra Blackwood made her feel positively tiny. She followed him onto the small porch outside the schoolhouse, closing the door behind her to give them privacy. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, but she felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This was unprecedented. Ezra Blackwood seeking her out, asking for a private conversation. In all her years in Red Fern Ridge, they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, mostly polite greetings at Sunday service. He stood with his back to the vast prairie, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling. There was something in his manner, a purposefulness, a gravity that suggested this was no casual visit to inquire about a neighbor child's education. "Miss Wynne," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke again, his words were measured, deliberate. "I reckon you might think this strange, me coming here like this, but I've got something important to discuss with you." Abigail folded her hands in front of her, a gesture she had unconsciously adopted over the years when she felt nervous or uncertain. "I'm listening, Mr. Blackwood." He looked at her directly then, those deep brown eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. In the distance, she could hear the children's voices through the schoolhouse windows, the familiar sounds of learning and childhood that had formed the soundtrack of her adult life. "I need a wife," he said simply, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "And you need protection." The words hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and overwhelming. She stared at him, certain she had misheard, but his expression remained steady, serious, waiting for her response to what was surely the most extraordinary statement anyone had ever made to her. She began, then stopped, her mind reeling. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Mr. Blackwood." "I'm not asking," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm stating a fact. 2 facts, actually. I've got a ranch that needs a woman's touch, and there are men in this territory who've been asking questions about you. Dangerous men. You've got nobody to look after you when trouble comes, and this town's got ideas about unmarried women that ain't getting any kinder with time." His directness was both shocking and somehow refreshing. No flowery speeches, no false promises, just an honest assessment of their respective situations. It should have offended her, this reduction of marriage to mere practicality. But instead she found herself listening, truly listening to what he was saying. Mr. Blackwood, I hardly know you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You know I'm honest, he replied. You know I work hard and pay my debts. You know I've never been married and never had children, and you know this ranch could provide for you better than teaching school ever will. He paused, then added more softly, and you know you're tired of being alone. That last observation struck her with painful accuracy. How had he seen what she had tried so hard to hide, even from herself? She felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned slightly away, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The silence stretched between them, filled with the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the schoolhouse, she could hear Sarah Mitchell's patient voice explaining fractions to the younger children. This was her world, her carefully constructed life of purpose and independence, and this man was asking her to leave it all behind for something she could not even fully comprehend. I don't understand why you've come to me, she said at last. Surely there are younger women, unmarried girls who would... I don't want a girl, he interrupted, not unkindly. I want a woman who knows her own mind, who's faced life and not run from it. I want someone I can talk to when the work's done, someone who can hold her own in this country. He gestured toward the schoolhouse. You've been doing that for 8 years. That tells me what I need to know about your character. Abigail felt something flutter in her chest, not quite hope, but something close to it. When had anyone last spoken to her as if she were valuable for reasons beyond her usefulness as an unmarried woman who could teach their children? When had anyone seen her as more than just the spinster schoolteacher, deserving of pity and patronizing kindness? What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Marriage, he said simply. A partnership. I won't lie to you and say it's about love. I don't know much about that particular sentiment, but I know about respect, and I know about taking care of what's mine. You'd have a good home, security, position as my wife. And in time, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. In time, maybe we'd find something more than just convenience in each other's company. The honesty of it was breathtaking. No pretty words, no false promises of passion and romance, just a practical arrangement between two adults who understood the realities of frontier life. And yet there was something in his manner, something in the way he looked at her that suggested depths beneath the pragmatic surface. I would need time to consider, she said finally. Of course. He placed his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow making him seem even larger, more commanding. But don't take too long, Miss Wynne. Danger doesn't wait for decisions, and some choices get harder the longer you put them off. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell, then stepped off the porch and walked toward his horse, a massive bay gelding that seemed to be the only creature in Redfern Ridge that could carry his weight with ease. Abigail watched him mount with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, then ride away across the prairie, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the vast landscape that had shaped them both. She stood on the porch for a long moment, her hand resting on the railing, her mind churning with the impossibility of what had just occurred. Inside the schoolhouse, the children continued their lessons, unaware that their teacher's carefully ordered world had just been turned upside down by a proposition as unexpected as it was unsettling. When she finally returned to her classroom, Sarah Mitchell looked up with bright, curious eyes. Was that really Mr. Blackwood, Miss Wynne? Papa says he fought in the war, and that's how he got his scar. Is that true? I don't know, dear, Abigail replied, her voice surprisingly calm. Mr. Blackwood and I didn't discuss his past. But as she watched her students work, as she went through the familiar motions of teaching and guiding and encouraging, Ezra Blackwood's words seemed to echo in her mind. And you know you're tired of being alone. The truth of it stung more than she cared to admit. That evening, Abigail sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the marriage contract Ezra Blackwood had left with her, a simple document that outlined their arrangement with the same straightforward honesty he had shown in person. The paper lay before her like a bridge between two different lives, one familiar and safe, the other unknown and full of possibility. The contract was handwritten in a careful, masculine script that surprised her. She had expected something crude befitting a rough rancher, but the penmanship was educated, thoughtful. The terms were fair, more than fair. She would keep her teaching position if she desired, have her own household allowance, maintain separate quarters initially, and be treated with the respect due a wife in all public matters. Marriage of practical convenience, she read aloud, the words echoing in her empty cottage, between Ezra Blackwood and Abigail Wynne, entered into for mutual benefit and protection, with the understanding that affection may grow, but is not required for the fulfillment of marital duties. The clinical language should have repelled her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. No false promises, no deceptions about love at first sight, just two adults making a sensible decision about their futures. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She folded the contract quickly, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to hide it. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, her round face creased with concern. "Abigail, dear," the older woman said when she opened the door. "I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I heard the most extraordinary thing at the store today." Word traveled fast in a town of 300 souls. "Please come in." Abigail stepped aside, knowing that whatever Mrs. Henderson had heard would be all over town by morning. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely." Mrs. Henderson settled herself in the tiny parlor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Abigail's modest home. "Now then, is it true that Ezra Blackwood came to see you at the school today?" Abigail busied herself with the tea kettle, buying time to think. "Mr. Blackwood did stop by, yes." "And?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the eager anticipation of someone who thrived on being the first to know the latest news. "What did he want?" Abigail poured the tea carefully, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "He had a proposition for me." "What sort of proposition?" The older woman leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. There was no point in trying to keep it secret. By tomorrow, everyone would know anyway. Small towns had their own mysterious ways of spreading information. Better to control the narrative herself. "He asked me to marry him," Abigail said simply. Mrs. Henderson's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Marry him? Ezra Blackwood? But he's never shown interest in any woman. Not in all the years he's been here. And you've never, you two barely know each other." "That's what I told him," Abigail replied, settling into her chair with her own cup. "He said it was a practical arrangement. He needs a wife, and I need—" She paused, the words sticking in her throat. "Security." The older woman stared at her in amazement. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would consider it." Mrs. Henderson set down her tea entirely, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Abigail, dear, I know the winters are hard on you living alone out here, but marriage to a man you don't love, and one with Ezra Blackwood's reputation. Are you sure this is wise?" The question hung in the air between them. Was it wise? By conventional standards, certainly not, but conventional standards had not served her particularly well so far. "What would you have me do, Mrs. Henderson?" Abigail asked quietly. "I'm 33 years old. I have no family, no prospects, and every year that passes makes it less likely that I'll find a traditional marriage. Mr. Blackwood is offering me a chance at a different kind of life. But he's so—" Mrs. Henderson gestured vaguely, searching for words. "Imposing, intimidating. All those stories about his past, that terrible scar. Aren't you afraid?" Abigail considered the question seriously. She had been aware of Ezra's reputation, the stories of his skill with a gun, his time as an Army scout during the Indian Wars, the whispers about how he'd acquired that vivid scar down his face. But in their brief conversation, she had seen something else beneath the intimidating exterior. "He was gentle with me," she said finally. "Respectful, honest about what he could offer and what he expected in return. There are worse things than marrying a good man who deals fairly." Mrs. Henderson shook her head, clearly unconvinced. "The whole town will be talking about this. Some will say you're being practical, but others—" She left the sentence hanging. "Others will say, I'm desperate," Abigail finished. "Perhaps they're right, but perhaps being desperate isn't always a bad thing if it leads you to make a necessary change." After Mrs. Henderson left, Abigail returned to the contract. She read it through 3 more times, considering each clause, each implication. The marriage would take place within 2 weeks if she agreed. She would move to his ranch but could maintain the schoolhouse as long as she wished. He would provide for her material needs and protect her as his wife. In return, she would manage his household and, in time, hopefully bear his children. The next morning brought a parade of visitors, each more curious than the last. By noon, it seemed half the town had found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or her cottage. The reactions were predictably mixed, some shocked, some envious, some disapproving. "I think it's romantic," declared Mary Patterson, one of her former students who had married young and now had 3 children of her own. "Like something from a storybook, the mysterious rancher and the school teacher." "I think it's scandalous," countered Mrs. Hartwell, the preacher's wife. "Marriage should be based on love and Christian devotion, not mere convenience." Dr. Morrison took a more practical view. "Ezra Blackwood is a good man, if a solitary one. He's honest, hard-working, and prosperous. You could do worse, Abigail." But it was 8-year-old Tommy Fletcher who provided the most compelling argument. When she walked him home after school, he looked up at her with serious blue eyes and asked, "Miss Wynne, are you really going to marry Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm thinking about it, Tommy." "Why?" "Because he fixed our fence when Papa hurt his back, and he didn't ask for nothing in return. And when Billy Wallace's dog got shot by that mean Mr. Curtis, Mr. Blackwood took it home and fixed its leg even though everybody else said it was going to die." Tommy paused, his small face solemn. "His hands are real big, but he was gentle with the dog. Mama says gentle hands mean a gentle heart." That evening, Abigail found herself standing at her window, looking out at the prairie as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. The vastness of the landscape never failed to move her, its beauty and its harshness intertwined like lovers locked in an eternal dance. She thought about the life she had built here, the careful routines that had sustained her through 8 years of solitude. It was a good life, respectable and useful, but it was also limited. She was 33 years old, and the dream she had carried from Ohio, a husband, children, a home filled with laughter and love, had slowly withered like flowers in a drought. But what if they didn't have to wither? What if, instead of the romantic love she had once imagined, there could be something else? Partnership, respect, shared purpose. Ezra Blackwood was offering her the chance to find out. And then there was the matter of the danger he had mentioned, men asking questions about her. She had dismissed it initially, but now she wondered. 2 weeks ago she had noticed a stranger watching the schoolhouse, a hard-faced man who rode away when she approached. And just yesterday, returning from school, she had felt eyes on her back the entire way home. She retrieved the contract from her kitchen drawer and read it one final time. Then, with steady hands, she signed her name at the bottom, Abigail Wynne. Soon to become Abigail Blackwood, the act felt both momentous and surprisingly simple, like stepping across a threshold into a room she had never seen, but somehow always known, was waiting for her. Tomorrow she would find Ezra and give him her answer. Tonight she would pack away her mother's wedding ring and prepare to discover what kind of life could be built on honesty instead of romance, on practical partnership instead of passionate love. The contract lay on her table, signed and sealed, a bridge between her careful past and her uncertain future. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of change. The morning Abigail delivered her signed contract to Ezra Blackwood's ranch, she carried her teaching slate with her, a worn piece of smooth stone that had been her constant companion for 8 years. It seemed fitting somehow, this symbol of her independence accompanying her as she took the first step toward a very different kind of life. The Blackwood Ranch sat in a natural depression between two low hills, protected from the worst of the prairie winds, but positioned to catch the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, a solid log structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. As she approached, she could see Ezra working near the corral, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. He looked up as she drew near, setting aside the bridle he had been mending and walking toward her with that easy, ground-covering stride she had noticed before. He was bareheaded in the morning sun, his dark hair catching glints of silver, and there was something about his expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, that made her realize this arrangement mattered to him more than his practical words had suggested. "Miss Wynne," he said, touching his forearm in greeting. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I wanted to speak with you before the school day began," she replied, drawing the folded contract from her reticule. "I've made my decision." His eyes dropped to the paper in her hands, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly. Whether from anticipation or anxiety, she couldn't tell. When he looked back at her face, his expression was carefully neutral, and instead of answering with words, she handed him the signed contract. She watched as his eyes scanned the document, pausing at her signature at the bottom. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression, softening, as if tension he had been carrying for days had finally released. "You're certain about this?" he asked quietly. "As certain as anyone can be about the unknown," she replied. "I have conditions, Mr. Blackwood." "Ezra," he corrected gently, "and I expected you would." "What are they?" She had rehearsed this conversation during the long walk to his ranch, but now, standing before this imposing man who would soon be her husband, the words felt awkward on her tongue. "I want to continue teaching, at least for now. The children depend on me, and I need to know that I can still be useful in that way." "Agreed. What else?" "Separate bedrooms, initially." "Sensible," he interrupted. "We're strangers entering a practical arrangement. There's no rush to complicate things beyond what they already are." His easy acceptance of her terms surprised her. She had expected some resistance, some assertion of husbandly rights. Instead, he was treating her conditions with the same practical consideration he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance. "Is there anything else?" he asked. She looked down at the teaching slate in her hands, its smooth surface worn from years of lessons and demonstrations. "I want your word that you'll respect the person I am now, not try to change me into someone you think a wife should be." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Abigail," he said, and the sound of her given name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I asked you to marry me because of who you are, not despite it. I don't want a different woman. I want you." The simple honesty of the statement hit her like a physical blow. When had anyone last wanted her specifically, particularly for herself, rather than for what she could provide or represent? The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. 2 weeks, he continued, his voice returning to its practical tone. Will that give you enough time to make arrangements with the school board about continuing your teaching? Yes, she managed, though her voice came out slightly breathless. Yes, I think so. Good. I'll speak with Reverend Matthews about the ceremony. Nothing fancy, just the legal requirements and a few witnesses. She nodded, then found herself hesitating. There was so much they hadn't discussed, so many practical details that would need to be worked out. Ezra, she said, testing his name on her tongue and finding it fit better than she had expected. What do you expect from me day to day? I mean, I've lived alone for 8 years. I don't know how to be a wife. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. I don't know how to be a husband either. I figure we'll learn together. The simplicity of it was both reassuring and daunting. No grand romantic gestures, no passionate declarations, just two people agreeing to figure out life together as they went along. She spent the next 2 weeks in a strange suspension between her old life and her new one. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of fascination and concern, as if she were a fascinating specimen of womanhood gone slightly mad. Some of the women tried to advise her on marriage, offering tips on cooking and household management that assumed she knew nothing about running a home. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, took it upon herself to educate Abigail about wifely duties, speaking in euphemisms that would have been amusing if they hadn't been so mortifying. Other women shared their own marriage stories, some happy, some cautionary, all delivered with the air of women welcoming a new member to their mysterious sisterhood. The men were simpler in their reactions. They either congratulated her on making a good match or looked at her with the peculiar mixture of pity and bewilderment that men reserved for women who made choices they couldn't understand. Through it all, Abigail continued teaching, holding her classes, and tending to her students with the same dedication she had always shown. The teaching slate became her anchor, its familiar weight in her hands reminding her that regardless of what else might change, she was still Miss Wynne, educator and guardian of young minds. It was young Sarah Mitchell who asked the question that had been haunting Abigail's own thoughts. Miss Wynne, after you get married, will you still be our teacher? For as long as you need me and I'm able, Abigail replied, though even as she said the words, she wondered if she was making a promise she might not be able to keep. Will you have babies? Asked little Emma Cole with the frank curiosity of childhood. The question sent heat flooding through Abigail's cheeks. Children. That had been part of Ezra's original proposition, the promise of sons to carry on his name and work. The thought of bearing his children, of creating life with this man she barely knew, was both thrilling and terrifying. Perhaps, she said carefully, someday. As the wedding day approached, Abigail found herself caught between anticipation and panic. She had no wedding dress. Such luxuries seemed inappropriate for a marriage of convenience. But she did have a good blue wool dress that brought out the color of her eyes. It would have to do. The night before the ceremony, she sat in her cottage for what would be the last time as a single woman, her teaching slate propped against the lamp on her table. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Ezra Blackwood, mistress of one of the largest ranches in 3 counties. The transformation seemed impossible to believe. She thought about the dreams she had carried as a young woman, romantic notions of courtship and passionate love, of being swept off her feet by a man who would adore her above all else. Those dreams belonged to someone else now, someone younger and more innocent, someone who hadn't yet learned that life rarely matched the stories in books. But perhaps there were different kinds of dreams, more practical ones that could still lead to happiness. Perhaps partnership and respect could grow into something deeper, more lasting than the fleeting passion she had once imagined. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in Reverend Matthew's small church, with only a handful of witnesses present. Abigail wore her blue wool dress and carried a simple bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Ezra had surprised her with, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans that he had gathered himself from the hills surrounding his ranch. As they stood before the altar, she was acutely aware of the vast size difference between them. Her hand felt tiny in his as they exchanged vows that were practical rather than poetic, promising to care for each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, but making no mention of love or cherishing. It was exactly what they had agreed upon, yet something in Abigail's chest ached for the words that weren't spoken. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it brought tears to her eyes. Then it was over, and she was Mrs. Blackwood, bound to a man she had known for less than a month. The ride to the ranch in Ezra's wagon was quiet, filled with the awkward silence of two people who had just committed their lives to each other, without really knowing what that commitment would mean in practice. Abigail kept her hands folded in her lap, clutching the wildflower bouquet and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. "Nervous?" Ezra asked as they approached the house. "Yes," she admitted. "You?" "Yes," he replied, and somehow his honesty made her feel better. The ranch house looked different as they approached, not just a building she was visiting, but her home now. Ezra had clearly made an effort to prepare for her arrival. The windows sparkled, the porch had been swept clean, and there were fresh curtains hanging in the front windows that definitely hadn't been there during her previous visit. He helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I've prepared a room for you," he said, lifting her small trunk of belongings. "Upstairs, facing east, so you'll catch the morning light." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable and well-appointed. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable chairs, and, to her amazement, a substantial bookshelf filled with volumes she wouldn't have expected a rancher to own. Her eyes widened as she took in titles by Shakespeare, Dickens, and Emerson. "You're surprised," Ezra observed, following her gaze. "I am," she admitted. "I didn't expect that I could read." There was amusement in his voice rather than offense. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She insisted on education, even for a boy who seemed destined for ranch work." This revelation shifted something in Abigail's understanding of the man she had just married. She had assumed he was uneducated despite the careful handwriting on their marriage contract. The discovery that they shared a love of books created an unexpected bridge between them. "I brought some of my own books," she said hesitantly. "I hope that's all right." "More than all right," he gestured toward the bookshelf. "I had hoped you might add to the collection." He showed her through the house, the large kitchen with its modern stove, the dining room that could seat 8, the parlor with its upright piano that he admitted he couldn't play but had inherited from his mother. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but had the unmistakable air of a home occupied by a solitary man. It needed a woman's touch, flowers and small decorations, and the kind of comfortable lived-in feeling that came from shared daily life. Her room was on the second floor, spacious and pleasant, with windows that looked out over the rolling hills she had grown to love during her years in Redfern Ridge. He had placed a small writing desk by the window and arranged her few belongings on the dresser with touching care. "I thought you might like to have space for your school preparations," he said, indicating the desk. "And there's a lamp with good light for reading." The thoughtfulness of these arrangements surprised her. This was not the casual gesture of a man fulfilling an obligation, but the careful preparation of someone who had given serious thought to her comfort and needs. As if reading her thoughts, he said quietly, "I want you to be happy here, Abigail. This arrangement benefits me greatly, and I don't want you to feel you've gotten the lesser end of the bargain." That evening they shared their first meal as husband and wife, beef stew and fresh bread that he had prepared himself. Another surprise in a day full of them. The conversation was stilted at first, two strangers feeling their way toward some kind of comfortable interaction. "Tell me about your students," he said as they ate. "Which ones give you the most trouble?" She found herself relaxing as she talked about Tommy Fletcher's struggles with arithmetic and Sarah Mitchell's exceptional abilities, about the challenges of teaching children with such wide age ranges and varying levels of preparation. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that showed he understood more about education than she had expected. "You're good with them," he said when she finished describing a particularly difficult day with the younger children. "It shows in how they talk about you in town. Their parents respect you, trust you with their children. That's not easy to earn in a place like this." The compliment warmed her more than she had expected. In return, she asked about the ranch, and he told her about the challenges of raising cattle on the prairie, constant concerns about weather and disease, the delicate balance between grazing and conservation, the satisfaction of building something lasting on this unforgiving land. After dinner, he excused himself to tend to the evening chores while she explored her new home more thoroughly. The kitchen was well stocked and organized, though clearly arranged by a man who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. The parlor contained evidence of solitary evenings, a half-finished chess puzzle, several books with markers indicating recent reading, a comfortable chair positioned to catch the firelight. When he returned, he found her examining the bookshelf more closely. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "You have excellent taste in literature," she replied, pulling out a volume of Tennyson. "This is one of my favorites." "Mine too," he said, moving to stand beside her. "Particularly Ulysses. There's something about the idea of always pushing toward the unknown that appeals to me." She looked up at him in surprise. "That's exactly what I love about it. The notion that it's never too late to seek new experiences, to become something different than what you've always been." For a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, and Abigail felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared understanding perhaps, or simply the first tentative step toward genuine companionship. "I should let you get settled," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be a busy day. I have work to do on the north fence, and you'll want to prepare for your classes." "Will you mind having a wife who continues to work outside the home?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about this aspect of their arrangement. "I'll be proud to have a wife who's respected for her mind and her abilities," he replied without hesitation. "Most men around here can't say their wives contribute to the community the way you do." Later, as she prepared for bed in her new room, Abigail reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. This morning, she had been Miss Wynne, spinster schoolteacher. Tonight, she was Mrs. Blackwood, married to a man who read Tennyson and arranged wildflower bouquets and thought carefully about where to place a writing desk for optimal light. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever in the passionate sense she had once imagined, but it was something more than mere convenience, something that hinted at possibilities she hadn't dared to consider when she signed their practical contract. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, and for the first time in 8 years, Abigail fell asleep in a house where she wasn't alone. The first weeks of their marriage settled into a pattern that was both comfortable and strange. Abigail rose early each morning to prepare breakfast, after which Ezra would hitch the wagon and drive her to the schoolhouse before continuing on to whatever ranch work awaited him. In the afternoons, he would collect her, and they would ride home in companionable silence or discuss the events of their respective days. Evenings were spent in the parlor, Abigail grading papers or preparing lessons while Ezra read or worked on ranch accounts. Sometimes they would discuss books they had both read, discovering a shared appreciation for literature that continued to surprise her. Other times they would simply exist in the same space, each engaged in their own tasks, but somehow together in a way that Abigail found unexpectedly satisfying. The physical distance between them remained. Ezra was unfailingly respectful of her need for space and time to adjust to their new circumstances. He never pushed for more intimacy than she was ready to offer. though sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her wonder what he was thinking. It was 3 weeks into their marriage when the dreams began. Vivid nightmares that left her gasping in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. The first time it happened, she lay awake until dawn, unwilling to disturb Ezra with her distress. But on the third night, when she woke crying out, her door opened almost immediately, and he was there, a solid silhouette against the hallway light. "Abigail." His voice was rough with sleep but alert with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm sorry," she managed, embarrassed by her weakness. "Just a dream. I didn't mean to wake you." He came into the room then, lighting the lamp beside her bed before sitting carefully on its edge, keeping a respectful distance. In the soft glow, she could see that he wore only trousers hastily pulled on, his broad chest bare in the lamplight. The scar on his face was matched by others that crossed his torso, old wounds that told stories he had not yet shared. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, then reconsidered. This man was her husband. If she couldn't be honest with him, what was the point of their arrangement? "It's foolish," she began. "But I keep dreaming about those men you mentioned, the ones who were asking questions about me. In the dream, they find me at the schoolhouse when I'm alone and—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the nameless dread that followed her into wakefulness. Ezra's expression hardened, his jaw tightening in a way that reminded her there was more to this gentle, book-reading man than met the eye. "It's not foolish," he said, "and they're not just dreams. Will Corcoran was released from territorial prison last month." The name sent a chill through her. Everyone in Redfern Ridge knew of Will Corcoran, a violent man who had killed his wife 6 years ago in a drunken rage, claiming she had been unfaithful. The wife had been Eleanor Matthews, Reverend Matthews' niece, who had come west to teach school before Abigail arrived. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, though a sick certainty was already forming in her stomach. Ezra's hand moved as if to take hers, then stopped, respecting the boundaries they had established. Before he went to prison, Corcoran swore revenge on the whole town, especially on whoever replaced his wife at the school. He blamed the town for turning against him, claimed Eleanor had been corrupted by teaching rather than staying home where she belonged. His voice was gentle but direct. "I've heard he's been seen in the area. That's one of the reasons I proposed our arrangement when I did. I needed to be able to protect you." The revelation should have frightened her more, but instead, Abigail felt an odd sense of clarity. Ezra hadn't been offering charity to a spinster. He had been trying to shield her from a very real threat. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. "I didn't want to frighten you unnecessarily," he replied. "And I hoped Corcoran would move on, find somewhere else to settle his grudges, but the dreams you're having, I think you've sensed the danger even without knowing its source." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. The soft lamplight cast shadows across Ezra's scarred face, highlighting the worry in his eyes. "What happened to your face?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could reconsider its bluntness. "I'm sorry. That was rude. You don't have to—" "It's all right," he interrupted gently. "If we're going to face Corcoran together, you should know what kind of man he is." He ran a finger along the jagged line that ran from temple to jaw. "Will Corcoran gave me this the night he killed Eleanor. I was the one who pulled him off her." Understanding dawned. "You were there?" Ezra nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "I was riding back from checking the North Range when I heard screaming from their cabin. By the time I got there—" He paused, swallowing hard. Eleanor was already beyond saving. Corcoran had a knife. When I tried to restrain him, he slashed my face open before I could get the knife away. "You saved the town from him," Abigail said softly. "That's why they respect you so much." I was too late to save Eleanor, he replied, his voice rough with old grief. And now Corcoran's back and I won't be too late again. Without thinking, Abigail reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the quilt. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them, and she felt him go still beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she said, "for trying to protect me, even before we were married." His hand turned beneath hers, large fingers enveloping her smaller ones with careful restraint. "I'll teach you to shoot tomorrow," he said, the words practical but his touch gentle. "A rifle and a pistol. If I'm not around, you need to be able to defend yourself." "Ezra," she said, suddenly needing to understand something that had been bothering her since his proposal. "Why marriage? You could have simply warned me about Corcoran." In the lamplight, something vulnerable flashed across his face. "Would you have believed me? A near stranger telling you that a man you'd never met might want to harm you because of a position you took years after his crime? Or would you have thought I was trying to frighten you for my own purposes?" He had a point. Without the trust that had developed between them these past weeks, such a warning might have seemed like the ravings of an overly dramatic mind, or worse, a manipulation. "And," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "there's protection in my name. The Blackwood Ranch means something in this territory. Corcoran might risk attacking a schoolteacher named Abigail Wynne, but he'll think twice before coming after Ezra Blackwood's wife." The possessive note in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. Whatever their arrangement's practical beginnings, there was something undeniably appealing about being claimed so definitively. "I should let you rest," he said, carefully withdrawing his hand from hers and standing. The loss of contact felt strangely disappointing. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Ezra," she called softly as he reached the door, "thank you for telling me the truth." He paused, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the hallway light. "Truth between us is part of our agreement, Abigail, always." After he left, she lay back against her pillows, no longer afraid of sleep or dreams. The danger was real, but so was her protection. Whatever else their marriage might lack, she could trust in Ezra's honesty and his commitment to keep her safe. The next morning, after breakfast, he took her to a secluded clearing behind the barn, where he had set up targets against hay bales. A rifle and pistol lay on a wooden crate, their metal surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. "Have you ever fired a gun before?" he asked, selecting the smaller of the two weapons. "No," she admitted. "Father didn't approve of firearms for women." Ezra's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Fortunately, bullets don't care much about approval. They'll stop a man regardless of who pulls the trigger." He spent the next hour teaching her the basics: how to load, aim, and fire the pistol with its shorter range but easier handling. His hands were patient on hers as he showed her how to steady her aim, his chest warm against her back as he demonstrated the proper stance. This close, she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing as he spoke calmly about things that would have horrified her prim Ohio family. "Don't close your eyes when you squeeze the trigger," he instructed. "That's a natural instinct, but it'll make you miss. And if you ever have to use this, Abigail, you can't afford to miss." The first time the pistol fired, she flinched at the noise and the kickback, but Ezra's hands were there to steady her, his voice encouraging. "Good. Again." By the end of the lesson, she could hit the target more often than not, and had even managed to group several shots close together in what he called a fine killing pattern. The casual way he spoke of deadly matters should have disturbed her, but instead, she found herself grateful for his practical approach. This wasn't about sport or showing off. It was about survival. "We'll practice every day," he said as they walked back to the house, "until it feels as natural as writing on your slate." "Will he really come for me?" she asked, needing to hear the truth, however harsh. Ezra was quiet for a moment, his face grim beneath the morning sun. "I believe he will," he said finally. "But not today, and not tomorrow. He'll watch first, learn your habits, look for weakness. That gives us time to prepare." That afternoon, when he drove her to the schoolhouse, he remained longer than usual, examining the building with a critical eye. "These windows need shutters," he said, running a hand along the frame. "Strong ones with bolts on the inside. And this door wouldn't stop a determined child, let alone a man like Corcoran." He frowned, testing the simple latch. "I'll bring tools tomorrow. We need a proper lock, maybe a bar across the inside." Abigail watched him move methodically around her beloved schoolhouse, seeing it through new eyes. What had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed terribly vulnerable. "The children will be here soon," she said softly. Ezra nodded, his expression shifting from the hard-eyed assessment of potential dangers to something gentler. "I'll be back at 4 to drive you home. Don't leave with anyone else, even if they claim I sent them." As her students began to arrive, Abigail was struck by how differently they regarded her. Young Tommy Fletcher actually bowed awkwardly and called her Mrs. Blackwood, with such formality that she had to hide a smile. "Miss Wynne is still fine when we're in school," she assured him, and the familiar name seemed to relax all the children who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Sarah Mitchell was more direct. During arithmetic lessons, she raised her hand, but her question had nothing to do with fractions. "Is it true that Mr. Blackwood killed 3 outlaws who tried to steal his cattle last spring?" Abigail blinked, startled by the question and the disturbing image it conjured. "I don't believe that's an appropriate topic for school, Sarah. Now, if we look at problem 6... But the girl persisted. "My pa says he's the most dangerous man in the territory when he's riled, but the most honorable when he's not." She said this with evident pride, as though her father's assessment of Ezra reflected well on her own judgment. Dangerous. The word lingered in Abigail's mind throughout the day. She had seen glimpses of it, in the careful way he handled weapons, in the quiet vigilance he maintained when they were in town, in the cold anger that had flashed in his eyes when he spoke of Corcoran. Yet he had never been anything but gentle with her, his enormous hands careful when they guided hers on the pistol grip, his voice soft in the darkness when she woke from nightmares. The day passed without incident, though Abigail found herself jumping at unexpected noises and watching the windows more than her students. When 4 o'clock arrived and Ezra's wagon appeared outside, she felt a relief so profound it surprised her. He was not alone. Dr. Morrison sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the 2 men appeared to be in serious conversation. They fell silent as she approached. "Everything all right?" she asked, accepting Ezra's hand to help her into the wagon. "Just discussing some town business," Ezra replied, but there was a tension around his mouth that hadn't been there that morning. Dr. Morrison nodded to her. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're looking well. Marriage agrees with you." Despite the circumstances, Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, Doctor." Only after the doctor had departed and they were on the road toward home did Ezra speak again. "Corcoran was seen at the Red Dog last night, got drunk and started asking questions about the school teacher." The Red Dog was a saloon on the outskirts of town, known for serving rougher elements who weren't welcome in the more respectable establishments. "What kind of questions?" Abigail asked, her hands twisting in her lap. "Where you lived, whether you were married, what time school let out." His voice was flat, controlled, but his knuckles were white on the reins. "So he is coming for me. He's working up to it." Ezra glanced at her. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes, but not as much as I would have been before you." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a tension releasing in his jaw. I won't let him hurt you. I know. And she did know, with a certainty that should have been surprising given how brief their acquaintance was. Ezra Blackwood might be many things, mysterious, scarred, solitary, but he was a man of his word. That evening after supper, rather than retreating to the parlor for their usual quiet activities, Ezra spread a map of the territory on the kitchen table. "We need to plan," he said, his finger tracing the road that connected their ranch to the town. "Corcoran isn't the type to make elaborate plans. He's direct, brutal, but he's not stupid." Abigail leaned over the map, her shoulder brushing Ezra's. Neither of them moved away from the contact. "You think he'll try to ambush me on the road? It's what I would do if I were hunting someone." The matter-of-fact way he said this sent a shiver down her spine. "The road between the ranch and the school is too exposed, too many places where he could wait. From now on, I drive you to and from school every day, no exceptions." "What about the children?" she asked suddenly. "If he's watching the school..." Ezra's expression grew grim. "I've spoken with the town council. They're organizing men to take shifts watching the school during the day. No child will be left alone." The protective instinct that made him think of her students as well as herself touched Abigail deeply. Most men would have focused solely on their own wife's safety. "This is why you married me, isn't it?" she asked softly. "Not for companionship or household help, but to protect me." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the map. "That was part of it," he admitted finally. "When I heard Corcoran was being released, I knew he'd come for you. Come. I couldn't just stand by and let that happen, but Abigail..." He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly. "I would have found a reason to ask you eventually. Corcoran just accelerated my timeline." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any touch they had shared. This wasn't just about protection or practicality. There had been other feelings involved, feelings neither of them had been ready to name when they signed their contract. Abigail's hand moved across the table to cover his, an echo of her gesture from the night before. "I'm glad," she said simply. The next day brought an unwelcome surprise. Abigail was reviewing geography lessons when a shadow fell across her desk. Looking up, she expected to see one of her students, but instead found herself staring at a stranger, a lean, hard-faced man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood," the man said, emphasizing her married name with a sneer. "Or do you prefer Miss Wynne? I hear you're keeping both these days." Instinctively, Abigail glanced toward her students, relieved to find they were absorbed in their lessons, too far away to overhear. She didn't need to ask the stranger's name. The malice in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "School is in session, Mr. Corcoran," she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't waver. "This isn't an appropriate time for visitors." His eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across his face at her recognition. "So, the husband's been talking about me. I'm flattered." "What do you want?" Abigail asked, her hand moving slowly toward the drawer, where she now kept the small pistol Ezra had insisted she bring to school. Corcoran leaned closer, resting his knuckles on her desk. "Just paying my respects to Redfern Ridge's new school marm. The last one and I, well, we had a special relationship." "I know what you did to Eleanor Matthews," Abigail said, her fingers brushing the drawer handle. "Do you now?" His smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "Did your scarred husband tell you he was sweet on her, that he wanted her for himself before I put a stop to it?" The revelation struck Abigail like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. This man was trying to unsettle her, to sow doubt. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I think you should leave, Mr. Corcoran." "Or what? You'll scream? Set those brats on me?" He glanced contemptuously at the children. "I just wanted to see what Blackwood replaced Eleanor with. Had to know if you were worth all this fuss. His eyes raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Can't say I see the appeal myself. Too plain, too old. But then Blackwood always did have peculiar tastes. Abigail's fingers closed around the pistol's grip, but before she could withdraw it, the schoolroom door banged open. Sarah Mitchell's father stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his expression murderous when he saw Corcoran. "Step away from Mrs. Blackwood," he ordered, raising the weapon. "Now!" Corcoran straightened, his posture relaxed despite the rifle pointed at him. "Just having a friendly conversation with the teacher, Mitchell. No law against that." "There's laws against threatening women, though," Mitchell said, not lowering his rifle. "And there's 20 men in this town who'd shoot you on sight for breathing wrong near our children." The children had noticed the confrontation now, their lessons forgotten as they stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before them. "Children," Abigail said, her teacher's voice steady despite her racing heart, "please gather your things and line up at the back door. Mr. Mitchell is going to escort you home early today." With remarkable discipline, the children obeyed, though their frightened eyes darted between the adults. Sarah Mitchell herded the younger ones with the efficiency of a girl used to handling younger siblings. "Such devotion," Corcoran mocked, watching the children file out the back door where another armed father waited to receive them. "But they can't watch you every minute, Mrs. Blackwood. And your husband can't either." "That's enough," Mitchell growled. "You're leaving, now." Corcoran raised his hands in mock surrender. "I know when I'm not wanted." He backed toward the door, then paused to look at Abigail once more. "We'll continue our conversation another time, when you're not so protected." After he left, Mitchell lowered his rifle with a shaking hand. "Are you all right, Mrs. Blackwood? Did he touch you?" "I'm fine," Abigail assured him, though her knees felt weak. "Thank you for coming when you did." "We've had someone watching the school all day," Mitchell explained, his face grim. "When we saw him approach, I came as quick as I could. Reverend Matthews has sent word to your husband. He'll be here soon." The next few hours passed in a blur. Parents arrived to collect their children, each offering support and expressing outrage at Corcoran's audacity. Dr. Morrison examined Abigail despite her protests that she wasn't hurt, and Sheriff Taylor took her statement with a gravity that suggested he finally understood the threat Corcoran posed. When Ezra arrived, the transformation that came over him at the sight of her sitting pale in her classroom sent a chill down Abigail's spine. Gone was the thoughtful, gentle man who discussed poetry with her in the evenings. In his place stood someone harder, more dangerous. A man whose scars told only part of the story of what he was capable of. "What did he say to you?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm as he knelt before her chair. Abigail recounted the conversation, hesitating when she reached Corcoran's claims about Eleanor. Ezra deserved the truth, even if it hurt to ask. "He said you had feelings for Eleanor," she said finally, watching his face carefully. "That you wanted her for yourself." Pain flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by anger. "Eleanor was my friend," he said quietly. "One of the few people in this town who saw past." He gestured vaguely toward his scarred face. "We talked about books, about ideas, nothing more." "I believe you," Abigail said, and realized she did. Whatever Ezra's past with Eleanor had been, he had never lied to her about it. "Corcoran was always jealous," Ezra continued, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Couldn't stand that Eleanor had her own thoughts, her own friends. He wanted to own her completely." "Like he thinks you want to own me," Abigail said softly, understanding dawning. "That's why he came, not just for revenge, but because he thinks we're the same. That you've taken another teacher the way he thinks you wanted to take Eleanor from him." Ezra's eyes darkened with understanding. That twisted logic makes sense, coming from him. He took her hands in his his touch gentle despite the tension in his body. "Abigail, I need you to stay at the ranch for the next few days. School can wait." "No," she said firmly. "I won't hide. I won't let him think he's frightened me away from my students." "This isn't about pride," Ezra argued, his voice rising slightly before he controlled it again. "It's about your safety." "It's about more than that," Abigail countered. "It's about showing everyone, that threats won't control me, that I have the right to teach, to exist in this town without fear." She squeezed his hands. "Besides, you said yourself that he'll watch first. Today was his warning. He won't act yet." Ezra studied her face, conflict evident in his expression. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever known," he said finally. But there was reluctant admiration in his tone. "That's why you married me, isn't it?" she asked, attempting a small smile. "Among other reasons." Something shifted in his gaze, warming despite the circumstances. "All right, but we take precautions. You don't go anywhere alone. I'll be with you every moment I can, and when I can't, someone else will be." That night, as they rode home in the wagon, the prairie sunset painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty seemed at odds with the danger that had entered their lives, yet somehow it made Abigail more determined than ever to fight for the life she was building. "I'm sorry," Ezra said suddenly, breaking their silence. "For what?" "For bringing this into your life. For not telling you about Corcoran sooner." His profile was harsh against the sunset, the scar livid on his weathered face. "You deserved to know exactly what you were marrying into." "Would you have married me if there had been no threat?" she asked, the question that had been lingering in her mind since his earlier admission. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, with his eyes still on the road ahead, he said, "Yes, but I wouldn't have had the courage to ask so soon." That night, for the first time, Abigail didn't retreat to her separate bedroom. Instead, she sat beside Ezra on the porch swing as darkness settled over the prairie. The night was cool and he draped a blanket over her shoulders without being asked. "Tell me about Eleanor," she said quietly. He sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from somewhere wounded inside him. "She was kind, intelligent, saw the best in people." His voice grew softer. "She loved to teach just like you. Said it was the greatest calling a person could have, guiding young minds." "You cared for her," Abigail observed, but without jealousy. It was a statement, not an accusation. "As a friend, yes. She loaned me books. We talked about ideas. Nothing more." He looked at her directly. "I never wanted Eleanor the way Corcoran thinks, but I failed her all the same. I should have seen what kind of man he was before it was too late." Abigail laid her hand over his. "You can't carry that burden forever, Ezra." "I can't set it down until Corcoran is gone for good," he replied, "until I know you're safe." They sat in silence for a while, the rhythm of the swing soothing beneath them. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant against the vast darkness of the prairie night. "Why did you really marry me?" Abigail asked finally, needing to hear the full truth. "Beyond protection, beyond convenience." Ezra turned to her, his face half in shadow. "Because when I saw you teaching those children, with such patience and quiet strength, I recognized something in you that called to me, a solitude that matched my own, a determination to make meaning out of hardship." His voice grew rough with emotion. "Because when you spoke at town meetings, your intelligence and compassion shone through every word. Because I'd spent 6 years watching you from a distance, admiring what I saw and never finding the courage to approach until danger forced my hand." The confession left her breathless. 6 years? "Since the day you arrived in Red Fern Ridge," he admitted, "I thought you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. not despite your plainness, but because of the light that shines through it. But what would a cultured, educated woman want with a scarred rancher like me?" Abigail reached up, her fingers hovering near the jagged line that bisected his face. "May I?" He nodded once, tension visible in his jaw as her fingertips traced the raised edge of the scar. The texture was rough beneath her touch, a permanent reminder of violence endured and survived. "You see this as a flaw," she said softly. "I see it as a mark of your courage, your willingness to intervene when someone was in danger." His hand caught hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "Abigail," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them to press her lips gently against his. It was a tentative kiss, an offering rather than a demand. But when he responded, there was nothing tentative about it. His arms came around her, drawing her closer, the blanket falling forgotten as they found in each other the connection they had both been missing for so long. When they finally broke apart, his breathing was as unsteady as her own. "This wasn't in our contract," he said, a hint of humor in his voice. "Perhaps we should renegotiate," she suggested, smiling. 3 days later, Corcoran made his move. He came not to the schoolhouse as they had expected, but to the ranch itself, in the pre-dawn darkness when he thought they would be at their most vulnerable. He hadn't counted on Ezra's watchfulness or Abigail's preparedness. The shot that rang out across the ranch yard came not from Corcoran's gun, but from Abigail's pistol, fired through the bedroom window when she spotted movement near the barn. The bullet missed, but it was enough to alert Ezra and the ranch hands who had been sleeping in shifts, waiting for just such an attempt. What followed was brief but decisive. Cornered and outnumbered, Corcoran still fought with the desperate fury of a man consumed by hatred. When it was over, he lay wounded but alive in the yard, Sheriff Taylor's handcuffs securing him for the return journey to territorial prison, this time with no prospect of release. As the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the road, Ezra turned to Abigail, relief evident in every line of his body. "It's over," he said, gathering her into his arms. "He can't hurt you now." "He never could," she replied, her arms tightening around his waist. "Not really, because I had you." That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Ezra handed her a small leather-bound book. "I've been wanting to give you this, but the timing never seemed right." Inside, Abigail found a collection of poems, Tennyson, Wordsworth, Keats, each carefully transcribed in Ezra's neat hand. On the inside cover, an inscription read, "For Abigail, whose strength and grace have taught me that practical arrangements can become the most impractical of things, love." "When did you write this?" she asked, touched beyond words by the gift. "I started it the day after our wedding," he admitted. "A little each night, after you went to your room." She traced the words with her fingertips. "I thought our marriage was just for protection." "It was," he said, drawing her close. "But protection means more than guns and locked doors. It means creating a place where both of us can be fully ourselves without fear or pretense." "I love you," she said, the words she had been feeling for weeks finally spoken aloud. "And I love you," he replied, the admission transforming his scarred face with joy. "Not because it's practical or convenient, but because it's the truest thing I've ever known." Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, winter snows and spring renewals, the cycle of life that would continue long after their story was told. But inside their home, Abigail and Ezra had found what they both had secretly yearned for, not mere survival, but the chance to truly live, to love, and to build something lasting together on the unforgiving frontier that had brought them together.